What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Aether Iron, a narrative-heavy TRPG with a novel combat system. But before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time, and I'm sure you've heard my usual stuff. There's a link down below covering everything I go over. Steam profile's public and down below as well. But in the case of this particular title, I wanted to mention that it initially came out at the end of March, on March 30th. Now, they did reach out and offer me a review key at that time. However, I was very busy with Crimson Desert and a couple other things at the time, so I was not able to get to it right away. And because I knew that, I went ahead and decided to turn their offer for a key down, and I went ahead and paid for it when I was ready to cover it, which is what we are doing here. Though I did know I wanted to take a look at it because I had played a demo previously, like in, I think it was like October of last year, and I was interested in the general premise. But let's get into more of that. So I mentioned this was narrative heavy. As TRPGs go, I would describe this as like 70% a narrative game and like 30% this novel car combat system. The game itself takes place in a sort of alternative history 1930s noir style based around the discovery of ether tech, basically anti-gravitational technology that allows them to float cities up into the air, unique ways of dealing with cars, that kind of thing. Overall, it's a fun, unique setting. They did some interesting stuff there, both taking inspiration from the time period that they based the game around, like the 1930s. You see some elements of things like prohibition, hiding social problems with decadence and grand displays, that kind of thing. However, I do think the game has a couple of sore spots. In particular, there are multiple places where I think the UI could stand to be better, in particular when it comes to like upgrading your vehicles, trying to figure out where your individual parts are, what car has what equipped, especially when you start getting multiple companions and vehicles going. That UI is a pain to navigate. On top of that, I do think the game has a problem balancing between the combat portions and the more narrative events. This is because as you progress through the game, your crew levels up, which gives you talent points. Your talent points both at the same time give you narrative power, that is to say, adding bonuses to the dice rolls you'll be making for the category you put the talent in, but this is also where you derive your car combat from, which means if you want to get particular narrative outcomes from a specific type of talent, you then just have to accept the abilities that gives you in combat. And I actually think this game would have been better off separating those two things. Like, for instance, every level giving you your normal narrative talents, but then every few levels just giving you a generic car combat ability to disperse how you please, which would give you more control over the combat sections. Especially on hard mode, where you're kind of boxed into trying to pick the more efficient combat abilities as opposed to the narrative ones. But that brings us to the technical side of things. Now, the nice thing about getting to this game about a month later is that some of the initial problems people had with it were already fixed. My understanding was there was a problem with one of the achievements, which I did not have to deal with. In fact, as far as the 100% goes, it's a very easy game to 100%. There's a guide over on Steam that will show you all of the missable stuff already. And as long as you grab that on your single playthrough and just kind of pay attention to the story, you should be able to do pretty much everything in one go, outside of having to grind out the car combat, which, again, thanks to the balancing thing that I mentioned earlier, can be a bit on the annoying side. Luckily, all of that stuff is cumulative, so you can just keep reloading the same battle to get those achievements, so not a difficult 100% at all. But those initial bugs were pretty much all that was noteworthy here. Everything else seemed to be fixed. I didn't have any issues personally, so hopefully if you play it, it runs smooth for you as well. But that brings us to the difficulty. So this game has 3 different difficulties: easy, normal, hard, primarily going to be felt in the car combat sections where enemies will have more health, that kind of thing. And the thing is, as I've already mentioned, if you're playing on a harder difficulty, you're going to have to prioritize talents that give you the best combat advantages, which might not see things working out the way you want them to, narratively speaking. Now, luckily, on the narrative side of things, most of like successful roles there are just going to do things like give you slightly better outcomes in terms of rewards or occasional extra options, but it's done in like a very narrative text heavy way, so it's not like integral to the experience to pass those checks. But I really do feel like you would have been better off separating those as a whole. So keep that in mind. If you want to play on hard, you really need to focus on optimizing for combat rather than necessarily the talents you want narratively. Also, probably as good a place as any to mention that the game does have a setting to adjust the road speed. So as you've probably seen already, the road is actually passing you by. In the car combat sections, you can adjust how quickly that is moving in case you have problems with like motion sickness, etc. But from there, let's move on to the story setup. So the story sees you primarily playing as a smuggler known as Gia. She has fallen from grace recently, having saved somebody's life at the cost of some cargo, only to murder a client, which has put her on bad terms with quite a few people, as you would expect. This has left her desperate for jobs, and so you get one such job, just simply driving a young woman to the lower sections of New York City, which is where the floating city we are in is supposed to be, only to discover that this young woman is wrapped up in some broader things with the research of ether tech, the things keeping everything afloat here, as it relates to the well. There is a gravitational anomaly nearby, which is causing all sorts of problems with things like storms, etc. And you quickly get drawn into a conspiracy involving all of those things while also trying to, of course, redeem your own reputation at the same time. And that's basically what the story is, broad strokes, without spoiling too much. This is going to see you traversing the city's underbelly. In fact, the city itself is divided up into several different strata. The heights, the uppers, and the lowers. You're primarily in the lowers, which are themselves each controlled by a local baron who ruthlessly deals with things as they please. And we see that in a sort of heavy-handed militaristic way, a bread and circuses type of way, alongside a more religious approach as we move through the game and deal with these barons. But it's an interesting thing overall. Now, next up we have progression. Progression primarily comes down to the crew level, which I've already talked about, alongside customizing your cars. As you complete side quests and, do combat, etc., you're going to earn experience. This is going to give you the ability to dole out your talents, which gives you your narrative and car combat perks and abilities. You can also customize your cars. Your very nice car at the beginning of the game doesn't last, and you have to start buying up cars elsewhere after getting an initial clunker. Each individual car is divided up into several different types, which have different abilities and can equip different things in their equipment slots up to their weight limit. Doing things like improving the engine and swapping out weapons, of course, determines how much that car can move and what it can do for you in combat, and there's a little bit of visual customization in there as well if that's your thing. You can occasionally find vendors doing things like selling cars, and then you have a sort of main base called the Hole where you can gain access to a general merchant that will be able to do things like simply replace car parts, that kind of stuff. You're also, along the way, going to meet several different companions, which are going to help you, of course, in conversations. You can actually get their skills as well. But they will also, up to 2 of them anyway, join you in combat, driving different types of vehicles and giving you some more options there, which can, of course, be its own form of progression. You can't really miss any of them, and depending on who is with you, you can have some different options available to you in certain conversations, but that is more or less it. From there, let's talk gameplay and world. So, as I mentioned, this game is primarily a narrative game. It takes place primarily then on the world map. The Hole, your main base, is where you're going to operate out of. It has access to all of your major services. And it's where, if anyone dies in combat, you'll have to go back and repair their car there and add them back to the party this way as they retreat there when they die. On the world map, you follow set routes, encountering things like surprise events, which are sometimes just narrative text events or can occasionally draw you into battles, especially with the game's checkpoint system. Each barony you find yourself in is typically going to have checkpoints and stuff for security, which may or may not search your car. How those checkpoints treat you is based on your current level of heat. Heat being basically how much attention you are drawing. This can be caused by things like the additions you've added to your vehicle can draw more attention, but also your narrative choices, and how much heat you have determines both how you're treated at these checkpoints, but also other things like certain individual dice rolls. You can get rid of this heat with the occasionally unlocked safe house to lower your heat and also have a chance at an item. But the narrative gameplay side of things, that's basically it, outside of the conversations where you will simply roll 2 6-sided dice plus whatever your modifier is for that skill, trying to meet the check, and then some outcomes can vary. I did not find those outcomes to be like wildly different, but they can open up certain options and make your life a little bit easier if you pass them. But there are plenty of situations where whether or not you pass a check honestly does not matter. I will also mention there are a handful of missable side quests. They're all in the first 2 areas. There are 7 of them to be specific, and you might want to check out that guide over on Steam so you don't miss any of them if you just want to do everything in one go. but there is some side stuff to get into that kind of digs into the world around you, as well as a little bit of your companions. How you talk to those companions can increase or decrease their morale, which will help you out in combat generally, but that's pretty much as far as that system goes, which brings us to the combat side of things. Combat is a turn-based action point system, of course, determined by the cars you are driving and the abilities you have. There are several different car types, coupes, sedans, vans, flatbeds, etc. Each of these car types largely determines the equipment slots available to that vehicle, which then determines what they can do damage-wise. So you can have things like light or heavy weapons, you can have undercarriage weapons which shoot behind you, you might have forward-facing or rear-facing weapons, there are storage compartments for just extra storage, and there are even potentially armor slots, but again, you do have to be mindful of your vehicle's weight limit as you do this, and all of that is going to determine the actions you can take in combat via those things. Now, you typically always get the first turn, which is important because this is a very positional system. The road that you are on has a ton of road hazards that you have to be mindful of, and the game is good about warning you about what's going to be changing in each individual lane as it comes up. Occasionally, roads will even split, and you'll have two concurrent roads running that you can, at great AP cost, jump between. There are lanes that will catch on fire, or blind you, or zap you with ether tech, and positioning plays a really big role here. There are also multiple different damage types based upon the weaponry you have access to, but as you would imagine, the name of the game is to quickly take out as many enemies as possible, and this is where positioning comes in. There are occasionally lanes where if you end your turn in that lane, you're going to die, and this is easy enough to manipulate with most cases because you can get a combat ability called Switcheroo, which will let you swap positions with a vehicle, and then you get another ability called Ram, which will push them over. And you can utilize those two to, in fact, force enemies into lanes where they will get immediately destroyed or simply get hit by incoming road hazards, that kind of thing. And so there's plenty there to mess around with. But again, combat is not nearly as frequent as I would have liked. You can do things like force events and reload combat encounters, of course, but again, by and large, this is much more of a narratively focused title than it is a combat one, and so I do wish it was just a little easier to focus talents separately onto the car combat side of things, so you could focus on that a little more, as I do think the novelty of this is interesting, because you see games that use this like actively moving situation occasionally, but it's usually more of like a set piece in a game where the combat is overall different. It's not usually the focus like it is here, which I thought was kind of the novelty of it. And so I just kind of wish the game focused on that a little more as opposed to it being more of a side thing here. Because while you can get super into like how to deal with individual positioning or trying to optimize action points versus armor, that kind of thing, like for instance the coupes and the lighter vehicles more generally get more action points but don't have as much health, and you can optimize that to a point with abilities from your teammates where you have like 40 action points in a turn, and with debuffing and hitting enemies you can just immediately take them out, and that's in addition to say having a character that specializes in moving the enemies forcefully where you need them to be destroyed instantly. And there's a lot of, I think, nuance there that would have been fun to engage with if they had just put a little more of it into the game, which is why I think things like the balance and stuff are a bother to me personally. But it's not really the end of the world at the end of the day, and I do think it is fun enough for what the game is. But that does bring us to the Steam Deck section. Officially, the Steam Deck is in fact playable, but I think that might be a little old. I imagine it will get verified soon enough. The main issue with this game on Steam Deck is that occasionally it does not show controller icons, and what's more, they got dinged for the text size, but I think that might be a little old, as I mentioned, because the text seems fine to me personally, and it looks like all that's keeping this from being verified on Steam Deck is primarily the controller functions and displays, which if you're fine messing around with won't stop you from playing it there, so it should be perfectly doable. That, however, brings us to our positives, negatives, and then we'll start wrapping this thing up. So on the positive side, the narrative, I thought it was interesting, I thought the setting was neat, I liked how they digged into common problems of the 1930s for inspiration into the narrative itself alongside the ether text thing. I think the novel combat system, which was probably the thing I was most drawn to personally, was also pretty neat. even if I wish it would have been more of the focus here. But for me, those were the most enjoyable elements overall. But on the negative side, as I mentioned, the UI in places, especially for like car customization and everything, could definitely do some work to be more clear. It's honestly very cumbersome trying to upgrade once you get like several companions and different vehicles and trying to figure out who has what and, what you need to buy, etc. It's just a real pain to the detriment of the rest of the experience. And then again, as I mentioned, the balance, I honestly think the best thing, in my opinion, would be to separate out the narrative and combat side of things, to where focusing on what you want to do narratively would not force you into a combat style with that character. And while you do have the ability to respec on occasion, I feel like just giving you a generic car combat ability and letting you choose from the available abilities would have been overall a better experience, combat-wise, for me at least. But that does, however, bring me to my conclusion. So I did in fact pay for this one. The game is $25 as a base, and for around that price you're getting a pretty fun narrative title with a novel combat system that I think is worth experiencing if you are into this genre at all. I don't think this game is necessarily going to like blow your mind or anything, but it's overall an enjoyable experience for a relatively tame price, and if you're looking for something like that, I think Aether Iron is perfectly capable of filling that void for you. But as for today, that is pretty much all I've got for you guys. Certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.